If you want to think about why inclusive marketing works, look at Barbie. They took the audience data, they realised the product they had wasn't truly representative of their audience, they made it more inclusive, and you saw a 60% increase in revenues. And when you consider the revenues that Barbie are already taking, a 60% increase is phenomenal.
Hello everyone and welcome back to Identity Architects, the InfoSum podcast that spotlights the leaders in the media industry shaping the future of advertising. I'm your host Ben Cicchetti, and over the last 12 months, I've seen our guest today speak at several events, and I always leave those sessions feeling inspired to do even more to make our industry more inclusive. So I hope today's guest, Lee Mabey, managing partner at Dentsu X, can do the same for you. Before we jump into that conversation, this is a reminder to hit that subscribe button so you'll be alerted when new episodes of Identity Architects land. But without any further delay, here's my chat with Lee. For anyone who might be unfamiliar, can you just give us a quick introduction to yourself and also to Dentsu X?
Yeah, so my name is Lee Mabey. I'm managing partner of Dentsu X. I look after a portfolio of clients that we have here. One of them, which I'm sure we're going to come on to a little bit later on, is Heineken and the various brands in their portfolio. Dentsu X are one of the three media brands within Dentsu, and I've been with the company now for 7 years and at Dentsu X for the last 3 years.
I love it. Yeah, we've definitely got a lot to cover off, and I'm really excited to dig into it. But we'll start the way we always do, which is with a series of quick fire questions to get to know you a little bit better. Starting with, what's your earliest memory of advertising? And given the topics we're going to discuss, I'm going to throw an extra one at you as well, which is, what's your earliest memory of inclusive advertising?
Okay, so my earliest memory of advertising, it's for an ad for a product called VA5 Hot Oil. I don't think they even make it anymore. And it's perhaps the most 90s TV ad that you can imagine. It's brilliant. I watched it the other day and it just gave me all the feels. But the earliest memory I have of inclusive advertising was an ad for Impulse, which is the female hygiene product, which was from 1998, and it was the first ad to feature two gay men, or very overt gay men in the ad, and that had to be shown after 11 o'clock at night, I believe.
Wow, that's incredible.
Yeah.
Well, luckily we've come a long way since then, and I'm sure we'll get into that as well. So take yourself back to that time. What did you want to be when you were growing up, when you were younger?
Well, nothing like I'm now. So it flitted between, depending on which day of the week it was, being a lawyer, a teacher, or a journalist. And evidently I didn't follow my dreams, although I did study journalism at university, so I at least got that far with it. But yeah, didn't end up with any of those roles.
What was your first role in advertising or marketing within the industry?
My career started in media sales. I spent the first 12, 13 years of my career in media sales. The first role was at a company called Clear Channel, so the outdoor media specialist. And I was in their sales team for 4 years. And that was where I had my first exposure to inclusive marketing, because I launched what we called the Pink Pound Pack, which was a solution where we targeted LGBTQ plus venues across the UK. And our first client for that was the underwear brand Aussie Bum, which is one of my proudest campaigns to date.
That is incredible. And yeah, something definitely to be proud of. I think that's awesome. What do you think it was about our industry that drew you in then?
I've always loved ads, to be honest. It sounds really trite, but I've just had this curiosity for the marketing industry, and I was perhaps influenced a little bit by the glamour of Stuart Alan-Jones from Queer as Folk and the life that he led. And that's what really drew me in. And I'm still here because of the people, if I'm honest. It's as simple as that. I love the people that I work with. I love my clients. And working with them to solve not only their marketing challenges, but how marketing can be a lever for growth in their business and having that broader view than just what we're doing in marketing.
Yeah, I love that. I think that's amazing. You must get to speak to a lot of people at different stages of their career, either at Dentsu X or at events when you're speaking and so on and so forth. What advice would you give to someone who is maybe just starting out in their career in our industry?
I gave this advice to someone very recently, actually, which is always be curious. This industry moves at a rapid pace. So don't accept the status quo, because how it is now will not be how it is in a year's time, and certainly not in 5 years' time. I joined this industry back in 2006. The biggest social platforms out there were Bebo, Friends Reunited, MySpace, they don't exist anymore, and Facebook didn't exist. X wasn't in existence. Print was the second biggest medium, and the industry, if you think from 2006 to now, it's changed massively. And part of the reason that I say to people stay curious is because that allows you to spot what's coming up and how consumers are going to start reacting to certain types of media. And there'll be new media channels, I'm sure, that are going to come out that we're just not aware of yet. And staying curious allows you to spot what those might be.
Yeah, I love that. That's great advice. Stay curious. I think it's awesome. A two-part question. What keeps you awake at night? And then what gets you up in the morning? What gets you excited and motivated in the morning?
I'll keep this focused on the marketing industry rather than anything else. So what keeps me awake at night? How this industry is evolving, to be honest. And how brands are going to operate within this. Part of my role is to advise brands in how to operate in the immediate term, but also taking advantages of things that might come next. And what keeps me up at night is how that is going to change. How, talking about what I said about being curious, how those things are going to change and how do brands react within it? Because the brands that react best and the ones that are more dynamic are the ones that are going to grow and survive quickly. What gets me up in the morning, going back to what I was saying before, the people, I'm really inspired by my team and my clients, and they're the ones that inspire me to do better every day.
You mentioned staying curious, and obviously one of the reasons we all have to stay curious is because we live in a very complex industry that changes on a dime on a very regular basis. So how would you describe what you do within media and advertising to a 10-year-old?
Yeah, I have to do this to my nephews because they don't really understand it. So the way that I describe it on a really simple basis is I connect people to the things that they need or that they don't know that they need. It's making very simple connections.
Yeah, that's great. I think that's super simple and makes total sense. The last of our quickfire questions, and a personal favorite of mine, although I get the sense that it's not a personal favorite of the people I speak to often, which is, if there was a song that was a soundtrack to your life, what would it be?
I love this question, and I'm a former pop master of Ken Bruce, so this is right up my street. So the song that was number one when I was born, so the one that's lived with me for my whole life, is Relax by Frankie Goes to Hollywood. But if you know the meaning behind that song, perhaps that's not the right song to soundtrack your life. So I'd say the song that I return to time and again, because it's soundtracked different parts of my life, is a song referencing queer as folk. It's called Hold That Sucker Down by OT Quartet. It's been with me at various points in my life, always guaranteed to get me on the dance floor, and I want it played at my funeral, so it will stay with me until the very end.
I love that. That's an awesome choice. We have a playlist on Spotify where we add all these songs, so we'll add that and then everyone can enjoy it as well. We'll dig into some of the more topic-related questions now, and before we pick your brains on the industry landscape as it exists today, I'd like to set a little bit of context for the listeners. As I mentioned, I've heard you speak at a couple of events recently, Advertising Live last year and then Future Brands earlier this year, on a very specific campaign that I'm hoping you can talk to our listeners about, which was the Strongbow Brighton Pride campaign, which I saw ran again this year in 2024. Can you tell us a little bit about that campaign, its background, and how it came to be?
Yeah, so Strongbow is a brand that's part of the Heineken portfolio. And I think it's important to look at the Heineken portfolio in its entirety. So about 2021, we was approached by their then head of media to assess how marketing can play into the inclusivity, sustainability, diversity agenda that they had. And we created a framework which we called the Heineken Collective, which was looking at different points in the marketing, all the different touch points within the marketing landscape, and how we could be more inclusive or sustainable in our behaviours. And part of that was that certain brands were further along in their life stage, and we could identify that certain brands would be synonymous with particular audiences. And Strongbow were going through a rebrand with the Take Bow platform. And what we identified as part of that is it was going to be the cider which is for everyone. That's what it's always based itself around, but potentially hadn't been necessarily something they'd spoken about before. So we identified that there was an opportunity with Strongbow to focus around Pride, Brighton Pride in particular being one of the, if not the biggest gay pride event in the UK as part of Fabuloso. And we approached the brand teams with this opportunity to be one of the sponsors for Brighton Pride. And we then spoke about how Heineken could play into that as well, because Heineken aren't an organisation necessarily that have been that consumer focused. People might know who Heineken are, but they might not know that Heineken is a corporation as well. So we had an activation in Fabuloso in Preston Park, which was for Strongbow in partnership with Hunsnet, called the Stage of Greatness. But then the actual Pride March itself was Pouring with Love, which was an activation that Heineken did, supporting all their brands and demonstrating the work that Heineken do for LGBTQ plus people across the country. But the Pride sponsorship was something very special for us, because it was the first time that Strongbow had ever really played in that space. That not a brand necessarily that had been always synonymous with the LGBTQ plus community. You might be able to go and buy it if you go to a queer venue, but you wouldn't necessarily say it's the most, or previously said it's the most inclusive brand. But Strongbow had gone through a brand repositioning that was including the Archer, which is part of their brand iconography. That had been changed to make it a gender neutral character. So straight away, that means it is the logo was for everyone. They started speaking more about everyday greatness and how everyone can be great in their own way. And we also have various colours in the portfolio. So you don't just have cider, apple, you also have a rosé, a strawberry variant, you have dark fruits, you have apple, and that makes quite a nice rainbow. And so it just all fell into place. And as I say, we held that in 2023, did lots of amazing work around that. And then we run it again this year, which I think is vitally important. Strongbow didn't just dip in one year and then come out the next. They understood that when you start to support queer communities or any marginalised group in society, you can't just dip in and have it as a campaign activation. This is an always-on strategy. So that has carried on with Strongbow and their work with Hunsnet as well. We're into year 2, and there has been an evolution of the work that we've done with them. So, for example, we've got Hun brunches this year. We've sponsored the Hunsnet podcast and had guests as diverse as Jordan and Harry from Big Brother, through to Diane from The Traitors. So we have quite a broad range of people that appeared on that podcast. But I think that demonstrates for us where Strongbow are taking themselves, and they're not the brand that they were 3 or 4 years ago.
Yeah, I think there are so many important lessons in what you've outlined there. Firstly, the fact that, it wasn't just about pride. It was part of the very brand essence. They made it part of their essence to be inclusive, obviously specific from the LGBTQ plus community, but also the fact that it wasn't a one and done activity, meaning it wasn't just 2023. It's something they've returned to in 2024. And, I can only speak from my own experience, but I found 2024 to be a more muted pride from a kind of advertiser perspective. It felt like a lot of people were pulling their activities. So it's incredible to see a brand that kind of stood by their beliefs, stood by their brand purpose, and kind of continued it into 2024. I think, as I kind of alluded to there, in recent years, some have questioned whether brands should be focused on inclusive advertising at all, and more broadly on purpose-driven marketing. So from your perspective, and for any brand people that might be listening to this today, why is inclusive advertising so important?
There's a couple of parts to this question I think we can dissect. So the first thing is, marketeers, I don't think necessarily know the power that they have, right? And I will say this from a personal perspective. If you are someone that's from a marginalised group, saying this as a working class gay man, seeing yourself depicted on screen is so powerful. And growing up, going back to what I was saying earlier with one of my earlier answers, Impulse, the fact that ad was on at 11 o'clock at night and there wasn't much queer representation when I was growing up. I didn't see people like me, this closeted young kid. I just didn't see any positive, certainly not any positive representations. Any representations that were out there were mostly negative, right? So marketeers have a real power within them to influence and change society. And if that means having slight nods in your ads, that can make people feel seen and validated. That's really powerful. And marketers need to acknowledge that. But also why it's so important is it's about brand growth as well. And it's about what you are signifying to society. The fact that you are happy to have people of colour in your ads, which you shouldn't have to be happy, that should just be how it is. But we've seen the backlash that have come against some brands that decided they wanted to center their TV ad at Christmas and have a black family. And good God forbid that you do that in the 21st century. But that is so important that brands not only do it, but then stand up for why they're doing it. Because what you find is there's a very vocal minority that might sound this out and start shouting and saying, "Oh, you shouldn't be doing this." But if you bow down to that and you decide that you're not going to support underrepresented communities, as Target did in the US, it's quite a toxic thing to do. And you are saying a lot to consumers, not only people from those marginalized groups, but you're saying to allies and people who might be friends and families of those groups, right? And that is really dangerous to be pushing back on that. So it's really important because of what you are saying to society. It's what you stand up for. It's what you believe in. And so many brands will treat it as a campaign activation. But it's really important because you're demonstrating brand growth, you're demonstrating a commitment to society, and you're demonstrating the ability to want to change.
Yeah, I completely agree. I think it's so incredibly important. It's so incredibly important that people do it, that they stand by it. As you said, we did see a lot of people who didn't stand by their kind of commitment in 2024.
Isn't that mad?
It's crazy. Yeah. Especially when your point that you made, and you obviously alluded to the pink dollar when talking about Clear Channel Outdoor. When you consider that it's even if you take the fact that it's the morally correct thing to do or the morally positive thing to do to stand up and stand by communities, it's that actually what you're doing by not standing by that community, especially when you backtrack. And I would stand by something I've said before, which is the only company that I've seen suffer any real negative ramifications from their Pride campaigns or their inclusive advertising campaigns are those that then backtrack on those campaigns. And when you do so, you not only upset, obviously, the community, the LGBTQ plus community in this example, but you upset their allies, you upset their family and friends, and therefore you lose that brand loyalty. And that's when you then see the negative impact, not because of the campaign.
Agree. And I think there's been some really interesting studies around that and some great case studies you can have around there. If you take someone like Nike, for example, who I think are a great example. So when they supported Colin Kaepernick and their campaign. So for those who don't know, Colin Kaepernick is an NFL player. He was one of the first people to take the knee in the NFL. And Nike came out and they supported him with a big out-of-home campaign. And initially there were loads of people who were saying, we're going to go and burn shoes. And I mean, the idea of burning things, if we go back and take it really dark, if you go back to Nazi Germany and the fact that you were burning literature and burning things, and you have the disco sucks movement in the 70s, burning things, which was quite a homophobic and racist statement to make. There's quite dark undertones when you do that. But people were going out and they were burning Nike shoes. I mean, they'd already bought the shoes, so Nike already earned the money, so well done. But you go out and you burn these shoes. And there was a lot of negativity. And initially, Nike did see a drop-off in their share price. But actually, what happened in the aftermath of that was, within a month, their propensity to purchase or consideration of purchase from their target audience went sky high. They generated hundreds of millions of pounds or dollars of growth in share price. And all the signs were there that actually by them doing this, you were getting rid of the consumers that you didn't want to work with, and you actually were demonstrating that you could deliver growth. And you can look at other brands that have done that. If you step away, if you look at someone like a Dylan Mulvaney and the work that she did with a particular beer brand, where she, as a trans influencer, it was a 20-second ad that went out with her drinking a can of a particular beer product, and that company flip-flopped on that campaign, didn't support her, loads of issues, and actually what they ended up doing was alienating both groups of consumers, because first of all, you had people that were anti-trans more on the right, who didn't like what they were doing in the first place. And then you had the people that supported Dylan and people that were more liberal who were then annoyed that that company didn't support her. So actually you ended up, by having no point of view, you end up annoying everyone. And, you know, you can only look at their sales now to demonstrate how that was a really bad decision for them to have taken in the first place. If you stand by if you work in an inclusive strategy, one of the things you need to do is make sure that goes through the line of business, make sure everyone knows and is aware of why they should be doing it. And you don't then end up with the problems at that particular beer company, to say it's not a Heineken brand, but how they then got the negativity around it and their business performance has suffered as a result.
Yeah, and I think it goes back to what you were saying a little bit earlier on about it being part of the kind of the brand purpose and it aligning with the brand values. If that's the case, you're much less likely to back down to, you know, perceived backlash, as you put it. One of the things that I loved about the Strongbow campaign was its intersectionality, meaning while the campaign was about Pride and it was during Pride, it was also focused on inclusivity across the board. Can you talk to us about that and why it was important for it to be for everyone?
Yeah. The reason that we wanted to look at the intersection is that Pride doesn't just exist on its own. You don't just have people have intersectional identities. So I am a gay, white, working class man. But then if you are creating a product which is for everyone, you need to make sure that everybody can be involved in that. And one of the things that we realized quite early on working with Heineken was that we needed potentially to have an independent voice in there to identify how do we make sure this is for everyone. So Heineken worked with an agency called Purple Goat, which is a disability specialist agency. And what they did was look at the work we were going to do and demonstrate how we can make sure that it was an accessible event for everyone. So if you went down to see the event in Brighton, the Stage of Greatness, what you saw on there was that we had a area for people that were in wheelchairs, so they could view it. They had a viewing area. We had people doing British Sign Language, so when there was performances on stage, we made sure that everyone that wanted to see or read what was going on that they could. But also they identified some of the biases that we had in terms of our timings, where they said, well, have you thought about the drag queens and the timings of when they're going to go on stage? And one of the reasons they were saying that was that, well, they might need to have a loo break. And if you're a drag queen and if you understand drag parlance, they, for what honest, they tuck, and it might take them a little bit longer to go to the bathroom. And we hadn't factored that into any of our timings. So we had to change our timings to accommodate that drag queens might take a little bit longer to go to the bathroom than most cisgendered men will do. And so we had to amend our timings. And by bringing that independent voice in there, that allowed us to identify some of the biases that we had. And that's continued in the work that we've done this year. So again, if you went to Brighton Pride this year, again, you saw the signing going on. And it's really important we did that, because if you are going to be a brand that stands for everybody, you need to make sure that runs through the entire line of business, because Pride does work at the intersection, and particularly somewhere like Brighton Pride, which is such a huge event with loads of different spaces. You need to make sure that you could accommodate everyone that wanted to experience and have the same consistent experience.
Yeah, I think that's an incredible approach. So clearly, inclusive advertising is, as I said, a morally positive thing for brands to do when done authentically and purposefully, as we've touched on. But what about the commercial side? You've already talked about it a little bit, but can inclusive marketing be an impetus for growth within business?
Absolutely. I find it odd that people don't think that including people in your ads can be inclusive. And I would say this is a gay man, right? That you can reach me. Doesn't mean you include me. You might reach me with your ads on TV or online or outdoor, whichever platforms you decide to advertise on. Doesn't mean you include me. And by not including me, I don't feel that I'm part of your story, because I don't see myself represented. I don't understand what your values are. So therefore, you're not working hard enough to get my hard-earned cash. And what we've seen at Dentsu is that brands that excel when it comes to DEI communication will have a 40-point advantage when it comes to NPS. and that UK consumers are 56% more inclined to consider buying from brands that champion diversity and inclusion. Now, are you happy to leave that money on the table by not having good DEI communications? I don't think there's many brands out there that can do that. And one of the ways that you do this, some brands will struggle because they'll look at it and go, right, how do I do this? How do I convince them in the boardroom this is the right thing to do? And what I always say is follow the data. Yes, you can go off gut instinct a little bit, but always follow the data, because that is where you're going to be able to create that story. You're going to go into the boardroom and sell it up. And the best example that I see of this is Barbie. Now, what Barbie did in about 2014, 2015 was they undertook an analysis of their audience on a global level. And unsurprisingly, what Mattel found is that a doll which represents a tall woman with blonde hair does not accurately represent the general global population, right? Because we are not all Caucasian and are blessed to have long blonde hair. So what Barbie decided to do was to change the doll. Now, they'd already been going through this process for a while, but then they really ramped it up. And what you saw then is they created dolls that come in over 35 skin tones, nearly 100 different hair types, and 9 body types. So if you go into a toy store now, you are likely to see a Barbie with a physical disability, right? I mean, that certainly wouldn't happen 20 years ago. Now, the reason that you can link that back into brand growth is that since that process ramped up from 2016 to 2022, so I'm going to have this before the Barbie film came out and the impact that had, they saw their revenues increase by over 60%. So if you want to think about why inclusive marketing works, look at Barbie. They took the audience data, they realized the product they had wasn't truly representative of their audience, they made it more inclusive, and you saw a 60% increase in revenues. And when you consider the revenues that Barbie are already taking, a 60% increase is phenomenal.
Yeah, I hope people are really paying attention to these kind of case studies that Lee's sharing. I think they're so important. And for anyone who is questioning whether they should be doing these campaigns, whether they should be, ingraining inclusive advertising into their general marketing strategy, these are just such important lessons that we can all take. We touched on pride a few times, and obviously throughout the year, there are times when inclusive advertising becomes a quote unquote thing. And pride is one of those times where you see a lot of companies getting involved. But how can we ensure that it's a 365-day a year allyship from brands?
This is such a tricky question, isn't it? Pride and different events through the year, so Black History Month, or even religious festivals like Ramadan, Diwali, Hanukkah, Christmas, if you want to sort of look at it from a Christian perspective as well, they become landmark events in the year, right? And so you can plan your calendar out around those in terms of how you want to target particular communities. But the world is really tough right now, right? And we are becoming more polarized as a society. But what gives me hope is that I know there's more that unites us and divides us, right? And I think the way that a couple of months ago that people came together and really stood up against some of the issues we had in the UK at that time has given me hope. But what we need is brands to stand up throughout the year as well. That you don't just go, here's Pride, here's Black History Month, here's Ramadan. We need brands to be present throughout the year. Of course, your spend is going to peak in those periods. It'd be ridiculous for me to say put your spend in those years and those points in the year. But what you should be doing is ensuring that you have a drumbeat, a cadence of communication with those audiences throughout the year. And you should be engaging queer audiences in November as much as you are in June. You should be making sure that you've got diverse representation. You've got representation of Muslim people in your ads, not just around Ramadan, but throughout the year. Because guess what? Our lives don't change from June into July, right? So what brands need to do is realize that. And yes, you can have your tentpole moments. And yes, that's when you're probably going to have most of your investment going in. But what you need to do is, what is your ongoing drumbeat of communications throughout the year? And don't just look at Pride as a campaign activation, because if you look at it like that and you have that in your mindset. And again, you can apply any religious festival into that as well. What will then happen is that will become the only thing that you will do. Whereas if you just go, what is our line on our plan, which means that we need to go throughout the whole year, how are we going to have diverse representation in our ads? That will then set you apart. And that will then mean that you're not just focusing on those tentpole moments. You've got a drumbeat of communication that goes throughout the whole year.
That's great advice. That's really useful advice. Obviously, hopefully what I said earlier is true, that I'm hoping there are brand advertisers and brand marketers and people at agencies that are listening to this and can kind of take lessons and learnings from this. But obviously, some will continue to be nervous and unsure of how to get started. What advice would you offer to those individuals? How can they get started? And more importantly, how can they get it right?
I understand that this is an area that marketeers are scared about, because we've all seen the backlash when it goes wrong, because when it goes wrong, it can go very wrong. And you don't want to be the next, let's say, Kendall Jenner and Pepsi, right? No one wants that, because that was an unmitigated disaster. But the way that you go about this is by going into it with good intentions. So what I said earlier around the data, follow the data, identify those audiences, challenge your media and creative agencies around the audience insight. That's really important, because what you'll then do is you'll identify trends or particular audiences your biases might have made you ignore. Do research. I was at an event a couple of years ago with an FMCG brand where it was for Black History Month. And I said to the people in the room, how many of you understand how a Black British audience consumes your product? And it was like silence in the room. And I said, well, unless you know how the audience is consuming your product, and when I spoke to my Black friends, they did consume it in a way that I wouldn't do, and I won't say who it was, but so straight away you need to do the insight, you need to do the research and identify how you move on from there, because that allows you then to have that confidence that you're doing the right thing. But know that you might get it wrong, and if you do get it wrong, hold your hands up and admit to it. But if you follow the data, you're not going to go far wrong. And one of the other things I would say with this is make sure that this goes throughout the whole business. Because one of the challenges that you're going to get is you are going to have backlash that comes against inclusive campaigns. Those trolls that are on social media who might be going out and criticizing your brand because they dared to put diverse representation in an ad. But make sure that your social teams know how to respond to that negative backlash. Make sure that your senior leadership, if they're asked a question in an interview, going back to that beer brand, one of the problems they had is their exec leadership didn't know how to answer questions on this topic. Make sure that everyone's got those briefing notes and everyone goes ahead and knows what to say and that you understand why you're doing it. And one of the problems with inclusive marketing is it's not joined up throughout the entire business. And I don't think anyone wants to go into this and get it wrong, but they do, because it's not joined up and they've not got that joined up thinking. So if you look back to, the M&S sandwich, for those who don't know, the LGBT sandwich, which is a play on the BLT and the LGBT community, the difference was they added guacamole into the sandwich. Good intentions, a percentage of that was going to LGBTQ plus causes, but the information about it wasn't that obvious when you looked at the pack. And I've got friends that at the time that worked for M&S, and they were so proud of their organisation for what they were doing, but the execution was clunky. And if they'd have been more joined up in their approach, they'd been more vocal in what they were doing, potentially that wouldn't have been the flop that it was. So no, you might get it wrong, but if you follow the data and you've got your senior leadership on board and that everyone involved in the marketing touch points knows why you're doing it and knows the story to tell, you're not going to go far wrong.
I think that's great advice. And I think the other thing that I've seen is it's just the importance of including the communities you're trying to reach in that campaign planning. So including the LGBTQ plus community in that campaign planning. And obviously, agencies like Dentsu X have a role to play where they can help be that sounding board and provide that creative input. So it requires a diverse team to bring that authentic perspective to the table. Can you share how your agency, as an example, fosters that diversity and inclusion within your own team, and how that internal approach influences then the campaigns that you create?
So the way that we go about this is if we're looking at campaigns and we're doing work with a particular community, you get those lived experiences in there. So I was recently working on a pitch where, when we started to dive into the data, we identified that this particular brand that we were working on was very synonymous with particular ethnic groups. And the team that we didn't have any representation from that. So what we did was we reached out to our ERGs here, so ERGs, employee relations groups, and asked, did anyone have the time to volunteer to be part of this pitch team? And the work that we got off it was richer because, lo and behold, you had people that were in that group that understand this particular product and the proposition, and the work that we created was infinitely better by having that perspective in the room. So I think what you need to do is just check your own biases, making sure that everyone is comfortable using the particular language as well, because often what you find is that people might not feel necessarily comfortable talking about, for no fault of their own, but they might not feel comfortable talking about with a client about ethnicity or gender or sexual orientation or disability or any other protected characteristic because they're worried about getting it wrong. So in that case, bring someone into the room who can support you through that and make those recommendations. Because what I have found, clients are really receptive to this. They need someone to tell them to do the right thing, and often that's the agency needs to tell them to do the right thing. And so if you don't feel comfortable doing that yourself, bring someone into the room who can do that. And the reason this is really important to do is that inclusive teams are proven to be more profitable for organizations. If you look at McKinsey, you know that they've demonstrated that companies are in the highest quartile for ethnic diversity and gender diversity, substantially outperform those who are in the bottom quartile. And Deloitte demonstrated that brands that have high growth targets are nearly 2 times as likely to have DEI-related talent objectives than negative growth brands, right? So you're seeing there, by having diverse perspectives in the room, you're going to deliver growth. You're more likely to deliver growth, which is great for businesses. And what I would say to marketeers and leaders out there is check your own biases. Look at your teams when you're working on a particular campaign. And if they do not look diverse, if they're not diverse from perspectives and lived experiences, the chances are what you're going to end up is groupthink and not have great ideas that are going to challenge clients.
Yeah. That's great advice. I feel like I've said that a lot on this podcast. It's just been really, really useful. And I think for people listening, it's giving them the information they need and kind of the guidance they need to know how to do, the right things and do it in an effective way. What will it take for us to not have to have these conversations anymore, right? So in an ideal world, you and I shouldn't have to sit here and talk about why LGBTQ+ inclusivity and inclusivity as a whole should be part of the advertising campaign. But what's it going to take for us to get to that point where it just becomes the norm?
I'm really glad you said that, because I would like to get to a point, as much as I love talking about this subject, Ben, I'd like to get to a point where I don't have to talk about it because marketeers just accept it and this is what they do. What it's going to take is more brands to be doing it and doing it well. That's what it's going to take. It's going to have to get people to be a bit braver and to be investing in diverse media platforms and diverse media owners to make sure that you've got the talent not only in front of the camera, but diverse talent behind the camera. And you're going to have to get marketeers to be really comfortable talking about this, because this is an area where I think the consumers are ahead of where the marketing industry is, right? That consumers just expect brands to be doing this now. And again, referencing that work we've done at Dentsu, over 50% of consumers don't know what a brand's DEI strategy is, and that's a bit worrying, because if you think that 56% of consumers are more likely to feel favourable about buying from a brand if it's based on the DEI credentials, if over half of people don't know what those credentials are, you're missing out on quite a bit. So what it's going to take to become the norm is for us all to get a bit more comfortable with it, being brave, and also, going back to what I said earlier, stand up to the trolls, because people are so afraid of getting it wrong. And the research that we've shown at Dentsu is it is a vocal minority. It's only 8% of people feel negative towards a brand because they are inclusive. So you've got 92% of people which are either apathetic at worst, at best, want to hear what you're saying. And rather than give that 92% the credit they deserve, we give the agency to the 8%. And what it's going to take is for people to ignore the 8%, the nonsense they spout, and focus on the 92% who want to hear from you or are apathetic to what you're doing. 92% versus 8%, those are the numbers I'll be focusing on.
Follow the data, as you put it earlier, and that's clearly the data that we should be focused on. Before we wrap things up, is there anything we haven't touched on or that we haven't mentioned that you feel we should?
Yes, I'd say one of the things we haven't mentioned is, going back to one of the earlier questions, don't wait for the ideal time to start this. Because if you wait till the ideal time, you will never, ever get this off the ground. You don't have to wait until you have the perfect internal setup or the perfect, you've closed all your gender and ethnicity and sexual orientation pay gaps, and you've got all your ERG set up, because this industry in DEI moves so quickly and evolves that you'll always be chasing your tail and you just won't get going. What I will say is start. Start from somewhere, start small, and then build from there. And actually what you'll find, as soon as you're in it, you're on. And what's been very interesting in the years that I've been focusing on DEI marketing is the brands are doing this spectacularly well. And you look at them and go, they're gold standard. They're the ones who go, we should be doing more. And you're going, but you're the ones everyone looks up to, right? And when you know that the ones that are great think they could be doing more, that should be your license to go, do you know what, actually, let's step on and start our journey.
That's a great way to think to end things, and I really appreciate that insight. This podcast is obviously about individuals like you who are changing the way that we deliver better customer experiences across the board. So when you look to people that you admire within the industry, who would you nominate for me to interview in an upcoming episode?
I would say someone that inspired the whole Heineken outlook with the Heineken Collective is the global head of media at Heineken, Olia Diachuk. She loves data. She believes in driving positive societal change. And she is one of the most enthralling, engaging speakers you could hope to have. So I'd recommend Olia.
I love that. Yeah, we'll definitely reach out and try and get them on the podcast and have that conversation. Lee, thank you so much for being on the podcast. I really enjoyed this. As I said at the start, I had an unfair advantage. I've seen you speak at a few events on this, and I was just left, in particular at Future Brands in April, I think it was. I left the room incredibly inspired. You gave such an impassioned speech on why this was so important. So I knew going into this that this podcast would be fantastic. But I just feel incredibly inspired again. I love your approach that it's not just about the opinion and the viewpoint on why this is so important. It's bringing the data, it's bringing everything along to it and the proof points of why this is so important. So just thank you for being on the podcast. I've really appreciated this.
Thank you, Ben, for inviting me.
Thanks again to Lee for being on the podcast and for giving such practical, data-driven advice. But one of my favorite takeaways, and an important lesson for the entire media industry, is that there's a difference between reaching me and including me. All that leaves for me to do is to remind you to hit that subscribe button so you'll know when the next episode of Identity Architects lands. But until then, thanks for listening.